Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info. On the 20th of February 2018, Regional Theatre Director, Artistic Director and Chief Executive John Blackmore died at the age of 77. I knew him slightly during his time at Bolton's Octagon Theatre, for which he was Chief Executive for 12 years, taking over in 2000 when the theatre was close to bankruptcy, and leaving in 2012 when the theatre, then under the artistic directorship of David Thacker, was thriving both financially and artistically. Although he remains the Octagon's longest-serving Chief Executive, he arrived in Bolton with an already impressive record of working in theatre. Just prior to starting at the Octagon, he put together a plan to save Liverpool's Everyman and Playhouse theatres by bringing them together as a single company. In 1967, he was Artistic Director of Manchester Library Theatre in the days of Rep Theatre. He founded the company that later became Northern Stage in Newcastle. He was one of the founders of Out of Joint and remained attached to that company as chair of the board. He was director or artistic director of Midlands Arts Centre in Birmingham, the Dukes in Lancaster, Warwick Arts Centre and the English Shakespeare Company, and chief executive of Leicester Haymarket. He even had a brief flirtation with commercial theatre with the Bill Kenwright Company, which was enough to convince him that this was not the world to which he belonged. In March 2018, I spoke to Mark Babych, now Artistic Director of Hull Truck Theatre, but who served as Artistic Director at the Octagon for 10 years, about his memories of working with John and the legacy he has left for the theatre. But before that, here is an interview I did with John himself in October 2011 when he had just announced that he would be leaving the Octagon the following year. Just tell me, first of all, what prompted you to make the move at this stage?
Well, by the time I finish, it will be almost 12 years, which is more of a sentence than a stint, really. But, but no, I suppose I came at a very, very difficult time, and it was right on the point of bankruptcy. And it's one of those slightly weird stories because I'd done some work for the Arts Council North West. I established the Liverpool theatres, and he and Taryn asked me to come up and do that, and I managed to amalgamate the two theatres and draw up the plans and all that sort of thing. And about 9 months later, he said, "Oh, we've got another problem. Would you like to have a look at Bolton?" Because the executive director just walked out, and I had a note when I got there saying, on the back of an envelope saying, "Welcome, the cafe's bankrupt, and, we've got no central heating, the lottery project hasn't worked, etc. Good luck." So I took it on in quite a parlous state. It had narrowly escaped bankruptcy, and it was, at that time, the bit of producing that was left was created or funded through a thing that Sue Hodgkiss, who was a great benefactor, had raised money to enable, for 2 years, the company, instead of doing the plan, Arts Council and probably got together to do 3 productions. It will become a receiving theatre for the rest of the time. Anybody who knows anything about receiving theatre knows if you've only got 300 seats, you've got very little chance of doing anything decent there. Yeah. So Sue had made this money, brought this money, so enabled to do 8 shows a year, but only for 2 years. And this was coming towards the end of the 2 years. But it was the time when the theatre review was just taking place, a major theatre review for regional theatre, which was being led by the new head of the Arts Council then, who'd been appointed. So that was there. I arrived there, and when I arrived at the theatre, they'd never even heard of the theatre review or the Boyden Report or anything, and I had about 10 days, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but 3 weeks to put in an application. The short result was we got £200,000 a year, which replaced Sue's money, but what it wasn't compared to the other theatres was it wasn't an enhancement of money. And that was the starting point, really. That gave us the breathing space to develop, and I managed to take that through successive phases, if you like. I introduced a lot of co-productions for the first time there, which enabled us to raise extra income to put into the programme, and so on and so on and so on. And out of this, really developed a very strong financial performance, and I think an increasingly, though not in the first few years, I think, but in the later years, increasingly strong artistic programme. And I also built up and worked on Active 8, which was well established when I arrived, but it developed, as probably people know, into probably one of the if not the best kind of participation and education program in the country. So all that sort of some of that fell into my lap, really, and so I that's what took me on, and we finished in the black. From this deficit, we actually finished in the black every year, and then started to actually generate quite substantial sums of surpluses at the end, so that in the end we have now a very high level of reserves, probably more than I don't know all of it, but certainly. No, I don't know of any theatre of this particular scale of size that has the kind of financial reserves we have. So that's where it had kind of gone from to, and obviously with the appointment of David, with a new appointment, a new artistic director to sort of look at taking it to different directions. I suppose there came a time when you said, well, my home is 150 miles away. I go up and down every day. The theatre's actually at the most successful phase it's maybe ever had. Very successful at the box office, very successful with sponsorship. Quit while you're ahead, I suppose. Did you see what I mean? But I mean, it just seemed like an opportune time, really, to think of moving on. I mean, I've been in this business for 42, 43 years, and I don't intend to stop until somebody of a higher authority informs me I won't be able to go on. So I will be looking to it. I mean, I pioneered co-productions, for instance. I mean, not just at the Octagon, but I mean, I remember doing my first co-production when I was in Newcastle, when I was running, because I established what is now known as Northern Stage. I actually created that company in Newcastle, and I wanted to do a new David Mamet play that had never been done in Europe before. And when I asked for the rights, they said, "Oh, well, the Royal Court want to do them. Why don't you talk to Max Stafford Clark?" So that became the first collaboration with Max. So we did a co-production together, directed by Richard Eyre, of Mamet's play. And so that was my first co-production, really. So we go back to 1985. So, I've got a history of co-productions, and then I developed them enormously up here at Bolton. And, of course, over that period I've been here, I suppose it's true to say that we've raised £400,000 to £500,000 to put back into the programme, to enable us to do a much greater range of work in what is a small theatre that doesn't, because of its restricted size, can't generate the high levels of box office income that large theatres can deliver. So that was one of the things that I sort of pioneered originally and developed here as forming a necessary income stream to allow a small earning theatre like the Octagon to be more ambitious in its programming. And that's been taken on. We're still doing it. We're doing another 2 co-productions this year.
And when you first came, you said what the financial situation that you were in at the time, you must have been under some pressure to move in more commercial directions rather than artistic directions. Well,
it's tricky. Don't forget, I have. That's how I started. I was an artistic director, and when I started my life at the library as an assistant director, and ended up running the library as the artistic director of the library. And so the first 20-odd years, I was an artistic director. I directed over 100 professional productions, West End tours, and so on. So the one thing I knew about was directing, knew about theatre and running theatre policies and programs. And so I suppose, although I had one short period of working for Bill Kenwright, which is yet another story, let me tell you, where I learned the full horrors of commercial theatre, and so that was probably, I probably had a real understanding, I hope, and commitment to quality and doing plays that you actually felt were worth doing and were the quality. So I never wanted to do plays from that commercial point of view, ever. It wasn't why I was in the business. So we had to find a way of doing that. And I worked with Mark, as you know, for nearly 10 years, Mark Babych, and we developed themes there, like the Irish plays that he did, and doing pairs of plays. The Millers started there, not with David, but they started with Mark, when we put 2 sets of plays together. We did Broken Glass, which we did with York Theatre Royal, and we did View from the Bridge. So that was the start of the kind of Millers at the Octagon. Yeah. And sort of the pair plays, like when we did Jim Cartwright's 2 and 8 Miles High, that hadn't been done for ages, and so on. So we started to have a sort of policy and a theme of producing work, which hopefully David is taking on. So I think there was always the intention to develop an artistic policy that reflected, real creativity and depth, if one could do that, and took an audience with you. It's no good doing that if you don't take an audience with you. And what happened was that more and more audiences came. So presumably they liked what we were doing. But I don't think during Mark's time we ever really pandered to popularity very often, We tried to develop something. You don't always do good shows all the time, but you never do. So I think my background as an artistic director and a director of plays helped actually put at the forefront of what you do is the whole point of doing it is the quality and the range of work you're doing. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it. So you've got to make it work financially, but that's your key objective. If you're not doing that, then you shouldn't be doing it. You shouldn't be giving funding for it, really, should you? You should be working in the commercial theatre.
Well, as somebody with such a long history as artistic director of various companies, what's your relationship been with your artistic directors? Have you never wanted to sort of jump in and do some things yourself?
I think that's a good question. I haven't yearned to get back on the floor and direct plays, particularly. What I think I've had, and I think it worked probably more successfully than it does with David, that I was able to contribute if people wanted to ask me. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just give you one little example. Mark was very good because he said, come to the run-through. We're doing Oh, What a Lovely War. And it's a play I know very well. I was involved in. I worked with Ken Hill, who succeeded Joan Littlewood at Stratford East, and Ken was my associate director up in Newcastle for about 10 years. So I was very immersed in Joan Littlewood's work, you see. And I was watching something, and somebody was playing the general. And I said, the thing about Joan was she hated actors, absolutely hated them. And she took real people off the street so they could be real people on the stage.
Yeah.
And this little example was, it was playing one of the generals, you see, and he was shouting, and I said, that's not a general. No general ever shouts.
Yeah.
He just speaks quietly because he's a general. And he's, so, and then we looked at the other figures and said, these are all working class people, and that's what they must be in that particular play, because that was where Joan came from, and a lot of her actors were literally taken off the street and joined her. She wouldn't work with actors, so she hated them.
Yeah.
Well, some of us can understand why. No, I didn't mean that at all.
But you mentioned that before you came to the Octagon, you were at Liverpool, and you did some work with merging the Everyman and Playhouse theatres.
Well, that was my achievement. When I came, the Playhouse was closed and unfit and had to have renovations to it, so it wasn't even open. And the Everyman was on the point of bankruptcy. And the City Council wanted to keep both theatres as individual theatres. They wanted to have the Playhouse as a sort of commercial theatre, and then the Everyman with its own, thing, etc. And the Arts Council asked me to look into it because they weren't funding it, but they should funding it for the second city in the northwest. Do you see what I mean? And there was an MP I got quite close to, the Jewish MP in Newcastle, who's very strong and very persistent. Anyway, I got friendly with her, and so she was always asking questions in the house as to why there wasn't a producing theatre in Liverpool, etc. And I said to them that the only way this is going to work is financially is you cannot afford to keep these as two separate theatres. You've got to have one company which runs both theatres, so you don't duplicate on marketing, don't duplicate on finance, you don't duplicate on all the administration, etc. But they both each have completely separate brands, and you've got a very strong brand in the Everyman of innovation, new work, Liverpool work, etc. And then you've got the Playhouse brand. So the secret is to have one company doing all that, but create two separate brands, and that's how I brought about the Liverpool theatres. And in fact, I drew up all the job descriptions, and I was in the interviews for the first appointments and things for that, because after that plan was agreed, and the Arts Council put their money in, and the local authority put more money in as well. And so I look back on that with great pride, having re-established producing theatre in Liverpool, which I suppose was at the time, most people thought it was a totally poisoned chalice and it would never happen if you know the politics of Liverpool, etc. But it's going to be very difficult to make it happen, but it did happen, so that was good, and that was why Ian asked me to come up and crack what he said was another tough nut.
So what do you think, looking back on those two projects that you did? They were very challenging projects that in the end produced two of the leading producing theatres in the Northwest. Yes,
absolutely. Well, it's hard. I mean, I was intimately involved in the Octagon and developing. All I did with Liverpool was to produce the plans and hand them on to somebody else to make work. The difference with the Octagon is I came in to make it work. I only came for 6 months. So I reckon if I've been there for 12 years, that's fair cop, isn't it? You know what I mean? Because I really only came for a few months. because I was on a freelance contract. You know, I just lived in a hotel, and in fact, I lived in a hotel because there was no else. I lived in a hotel for the first 4 years I was here. What was then the Holiday Inn, which was then the Moat House, I remember. I nearly lost my life when they had the fire, which may have been a blessing to British theatre, but there you go. So it's like Topsy. It just sort of ran and ran. You know what I mean? Like, it just happened, and because the great thing about it was, and the great thing about this period of my life was, I just stayed because it was successful. And otherwise I wouldn't have stayed. So you weren't hanging on to a job, do you know what I mean? Or whatever it is. And so what's very pleasing is to have worked, I hope it's not the last thing I'm doing, but towards the end, to work on something that's been hugely successful. And that's why I stayed, I suppose. At the moment it wasn't going to be successful, I would have said, well, you better find somebody else, who can do it better than I can. So that's why I stayed.
You believe in it in, you said before, an exceptionally good financial position, but in a period for the arts and for society in general that's very difficult financially.
Well, it is, and of course, I mean, it's going to get worse. I mean, we've got through to this point, but where we're going now is far more difficult. It's going to be far more difficult to make things work now than it has been. It's not the reason I'm getting out, I have to say. I would quite relish the challenge of that. But I think what that throws into question is a different kind of flexibility, a different kind of way of thinking about how you do producing theatre. And I remember I come from the very old days at the library where we had a permanent company for the whole season. Yeah. And we used to open a play on a Tuesday night and start rehearsing the next play on the Wednesday. There's a great story because at the time there was weekly rep about that. The library wasn't weekly rep; it was 2 weekly or 3 weekly or something. But Oldham was weekly rep. But they got some money and they were able to, because of the money, look at not having to do weekly rep, and so they went on to 2 weekly rep. So I met Carl, Carl Paulson, who was running it, and it was the middle of the day, and I said, "What are you doing here? Why aren't you rehearsing?" He said, "No, we're on 2 weeks now. We only rehearse mornings." Brilliant. It was lovely. Anyway, so I sort of go back to those days, do you see what I mean? And when I started at the library, of course, I said that we were all permanent companies. And we used to do 8 shows a year and rehearse them and never saw daylight,
Lots of people look back with nostalgia on those days of weekly rep, but it wasn't an easy life at all, was it?
You're right. I mean, I don't think in those, it's very difficult in those circumstances. You clearly compromise quality in those circumstances. It's very difficult, and also there's a lot of burnout. But we used to have a separate company. I had people in my company, included, starting their careers with me, Ian McDermott and Malcolm Story, for instance. You've got these extraordinary young actors, starting their careers with you, as well as the old timers. But the great thing about the library is you're allowed to do an adventurous repertoire. I was allowed to do Narrow Road to the Deep North. Nobody had ever done that outside, an art house thing in London, because it wasn't even licensed then. And I did Bingo, this extraordinary play about the Second World War, which lampooned Montgomery. And Ian McDermott played Montgomery, which he then reprised when he went to the RSC. They did it at the RSC. And so you were allowed to do that sort of thing. I did the first regional production of The Homecoming. Uh-huh. I mean, which they walked out in their droves from, once the shagging on the floor started, you know what I mean? So, there was the sound of seats going up was very large, bagging away. But you were allowed to do those things. And of course, it was run, because it was a library, it was run by the city librarian. You used to sort of go up to the 4th floor and sit there a bit and say, right, show me your playlist. And you show the playlist. He said, well, you can do 2 plays that you want to do, and the rest I'm going to make sure they do this, that, and make the money, etc. Yeah. So that's how you did it. So that's where I started. And Manchester, so I have a long connection with the Northwest, actually. I mean, my father was born in Manchester and raised in Manchester, so I've always felt quite at home in the Northwest.
What do you think the biggest changes have been since those days then in the theatre?
Well, I think that the development of the Arts Council, I mean, obviously, it was still going pretty strong when I came in, because it started after the war. But it sort of took off in the 60s, really. Do you know what I mean? With the Labour government and the money that was Jenny Lee was the great arts minister who really injected it. And I think that led also, as that money came in, it also led to local authorities taking more interest in supporting theatres. I mean, after I left the library, quite soon I took over. I went and ran Lancaster, for instance, which again was Arts Council money, and it was the Arts Council money which was really important. And the local authority rather grudgingly, to say the least. Well, Lancaster wasn't too bad, but I can tell you, persuading people in Morecambe to get money. Well, you see, I tried to keep a company together because I had a permanent company for 3 years, the same bloody actors. It was terrific. But we couldn't do it in the summer. There was no audience. So I went down to Morecambe, and I found a little old theatre at the end of the pier, and we did a summer season in Morecambe. And that was for political. So you see, you're getting something. Now you've got to fund us properly. And the first show we did, Ken Hill was with me, and I said, "Would you write?" Because he was writing all these plays and musical plays, and he said, "So what shall we do?" And he said, "Phantom of the Opera." At the end of this tiny theatre. So I did the first ever musical version of Phantom of the Opera. With a special score at the end of this bloody pier, where when it was raining and galing, the actors had to run around the outside, had to crawl around the outside, or they get blown off. And I did it again when I went to Newcastle. Ken did it again there, and we did it with Stratford East. And when it went down to Stratford East, Andrew Lloyd Webber saw it and said, "I want to use this book," and commissioned Ken to write the book, and said, I want to do my own music. So that's how he came to Phantom of the Opera.
So it's your fault.
It's my fault. It's my fault. Some poor bastard, they've got to watch that for 10 years. I wouldn't have minded having a percentage of it, though.
No.
Well, and Ken, because after about 6 months, he said to Ken, I don't need your script, really. I'll just get on with my own now. Yeah. A well-known sort of commercial theatre kind of plan.
So, talking of commercial theatre, you mentioned about Bill Kenwright. Is there anything you want to share with us about your experience?
Well, I'm not sure that there's anything I can say that actually would prevent you or I from actually ending up in court, actually. But look, it was very interesting to work. I mean, I was given the opportunity. I mean, I did a Streetcar Named Desire, which Peter Hall directed, with Jessica Lange, and stuff. So there was interesting stuff there. But the sort of terms and conditions by which you do commercial theatre, I mean, there is no romance in it at all. Let me tell you, it's all dirty underwear. You know what I mean? I mean, there's nothing spotless or shiny about it, and the margins are so tough on that, and the way that it works. I mean, there is a certain level of commercial theatre where you get that done differently, I have to say. Funny enough, I went to see Trevor Nunn's Tempest. I wrote him a letter saying, because I thought it was an absolutely tremendous production, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Working, but that's a slightly different commercial. That's not a Bill Kenwright commercial environment.
No.
I have to say. And I suppose what you come up against there, and what matters is that you get a clash of value systems, right?
Yeah.
And you learn to say to yourself, what are my values? Why am I in this business? And then you find that kind of conflict, really, I suppose, and then you can't continue. I mean, that's where you asked me why I want to do the plays that we do and things. I spent some time in Romania just after the revolution. I went out there with parties going out there to sort of talk and work with them. I actually brought a Romanian director over to direct at Leicester Haymarket, and we brought shows over, Silvio Corporetti shows and things like that. But I had a discussion with one, a group was living, and they said to us, why do people go to theatre in England? And I said, well, they go to be entertained. And there was this pause, and they said, well, why would they go to theatre to be entertained? So I said, well, it just sort of light. I said, but no. So I said, okay, so why do people go to theatre in Romania? And they said, you've got to remember, for the last 40 years, the only place the truth was told was the pulpit in the theatre. That's why they go to theatre in Romania. And for me, it was an epiphany. The scales dropped on. I thought, actually, unless it is about something, and it is about a truth, and it is about creating new realities and new views of it, then it isn't worth doing. So that's why that kind of thing, and it was great. I did a project with Romanian actors and a Romanian director called Simultaneous Shakespeare, when we did 2 scenes from Macbeth, which we showed up in Scotland, where Neil, who was running the whole thing at the theatre, one of the theatres up there, and I went out to Romania to rehearse it, in which we had 2 Romanian actors and two English actors, and the Romanian actor spoke in Romanian and the English actor spoke in English, and we did two scenes, and everybody absolutely understood what they were. But it was very interesting working with Romanian actors' approach to Shakespeare and our own, and then demonstrating this. So, you know, and because their theatre was a magnificent standard, it was an extraordinary standard, but it was all subtextual. Do you know what I mean? That, you know, they do an incredible Hamlet, which they did with the guy who was one of the people on the streets fighting, who they were given a house. It's called Unita. They said it's a union. It's not a union like ourselves. It was a house which Ceausescu's son's house. I stayed in it, actually, in this house. There were bullet holes all sort of around the ceiling and things. And then there was an enormous bed there. And they said, oh, yes, he was a bit of a lad, you know. This sort of thing. But that Romanian experience was really kind of important for people who were highly qualified, but everything was subtextual. So everybody knew what Hamlet was about if you were a Romanian, you know.
Yeah.
Hamlet, I mean, you know, the king in Hamlet is Ceausescu, right? I mean, you know.
Yes.
But that was the only way they could do it, through the classics. They could never write about it. So they had to do it that way, and then the whole audience would nod. And when Sherban, who was the National Theatre, who ran the National Theatre in Romania, left, when he came back, there was a huge theatre there we were taken to. There's a vast box in it. And they said, that's Ceausescu's box. And we looked at it and said, oh, yes, I said, so he liked theatre. So no, he never went to theatre. He just had this large box. And then there was an underground car park where you go and a lift that would take him up, etc. But he never went to theatre. But it was a statement, wasn't it, about who was in charge of the country. And when Sherban did the Agamemnon trilogy, Agamemnon sort of, you know, sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia, you know, so he could get the wind to go to Troy, etc., etc. And when he gets back, he gets murdered by Clytemnestra, his wife, because etc. So when Sherban did the production, he did the murder of Agamemnon in Ceausescu's box. which everybody sort of cheered sort of shades of kind of Libya, you know what I mean? Yes. So though they weren't overtly political, it was all about those values. Do you see what I mean? And I suppose I've always taken that with me. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, yeah.
Unless theatre does something like that and does work, which opens up a different world for you and shows you different worlds, that's what it should be doing, shouldn't it? Well, all art should be doing that, shouldn't it? You know, not just theatre, I mean, literature, painting. Well, paintings do it beyond recognition. They show you a different world that you hadn't realised until you saw it, like Picasso or whatever, you know. So I think those sort of things, in a way, were always with me when I came to the Octagon. I don't pretend we did that range of work, you know what I mean, that you'd want to do. But I think there was always, in a sense, a serious purpose behind it, put it that way. And I think that's the purpose of subsidy, isn't it? Is to allow those things to happen that cannot happen except through that, as John Littlewood said. So it's like, you know, if you won't have symphony orchestras, because what you'll have is that the radio program where you hear, you know, snatches of a symphony or at the most one movement. You know, don't ever hear the whole one, because it doesn't work commercially. There isn't a commercial system as you look at New York. I mean, there isn't a commercial system that will work that provides a theatre of creativity, value, and nurtures that. That's the nature of support that's needed, if you see what I mean. Yeah. For me, anyway, that's for me, but not everybody would agree with that, I know.
And it's always been subsidised, going back to Shakespeare, and even back to the Greeks, it was always subsidised by somebody.
Well, it's a laugh to say that, yes, of course, Shakespeare was subsidised. He said, what bit of the king's men don't you understand? You know, which bit of king don't you understand? I mean, you know, we've got the patronage of the Lord Chamberlain first, and then the king's men later with the monarch. Yeah. I didn't mean it wasn't supported. Of course it was bloody supported. But anyway.
This, you might have partly answered by some of what you just said then, but you mentioned before about the education side with Active 8, which the education at Bolton Octagon goes back really to the very early days of theatre and education in the 60s, but you really built that side up. What's important?
No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, you're 100% right. I mean, I did this when we gave, you know, Robin Pemberton Billing his, you know, we made him sort of, you know, an honorary life, you know. He's founder, artistic director and all that, and his book. I mean, he started virtually the first theatre education company at the Octagon. It started at that work started at the Octagon. And in my time earlier, I started 2 theatre and education companies, on my travels, one in Lancaster and one in Newcastle. And I used to direct, and I used to do workshops and all sorts of things that went with it. So everywhere I've been, I've always done that. What's particularly great about Active 8 is it's less education than fundamental participation. We're going out and working in disadvantaged areas. We have something like 8 youth theatres out in disadvantaged areas. We've got a disabled youth theatre. We've got a youth theatre for refugees. And it's not to do with the quality of their work, what it is. It's to do with what it gives them, the tools it gives them for life, to be able to express themselves, to get self-confident, be able to work together. And it's allowing them to have their own creativity. There's a great story, isn't there? The teacher who said, I want you to paint the most important thing in your life, he said, etc. And just, she looked at little Johnny, said, what are you painting? He said, I'm painting God. And she said, Johnny, none of us know what God looks like. And he said, well, no, if you start painting, you will. That's clear. But so it's very important that our participation work, and I mean, if you'd seen the Romeo and Juliet on the street that we did with kids on the street in the Willows estate, which the police joined. There was a wonderful moment when Tybalt was actually arrested by the police and shoved into a police car on the ground for assault and riot. And some work we've done a most amazing film with disabled kids working on a kind of reverse of The Office, played by some of the actors at the theatre, about this sort of office boss who thinks they're all a load of idiots, etc., etc. You know what I mean? Yeah. And these kids show it, and it's a brilliant film. We're going to sort of send it around to lots of races. Ken Robinson, so Ken Robinson, he's an old mate, but we're going to send him the stuff there as well because he's very interested in all that sort of stuff. So I think it's quite groundbreaking, and we're going to send it to politicians as well and say, the one place, not the one place, but it's very interesting in the Northwest that actually there weren't any of those young people's riots. And maybe one of the reasons is because of the youth work and the work that's going on and the connections that are being made and how important that is. And that work is. Because, I mean, it's the Widows Estate's tough. Make no mistake about it. It's tough. And the people working there and in our team, they're all women. And, there's a lot of violence and stuff that goes on there. But gradually, you're working with it, and they loved working on it, and we had a film about it. And for me, that's an incredibly important part of the work we do. It always has been. I've always done it, Worked in prisons, worked in strange ways.
In some ways, what you were saying about that Romeo and Juliet, I can see a direct line between that and the work you were talking about in Romania.
Absolutely,
it's about self-expression, isn't it? Having a voice.
Yes, well, it's absolutely, and it's the gift not the gift. It's the tools you're giving them for life, isn't it? When they can start to actually form relationships, they can start to see how important it is to network properly, how you get support in a group, how you can express yourself without looking a complete idiot. How you then can articulate the important things in your life without them being destructive. You don't have to get into fights to express yourself. You can express it through language, but moderated language. Although one of the things I used to do successfully when I was working in the English Shakespeare Company, because I was producing the English Shakespeare Company with Michael Bogdanov and Michael Pennington, and Michael Bogdanov's very old mate. But there's a wonderful thing where you do Shakespeare insults, where the kids are allowed to choose the insults and shout them at each other. You whoremongering rapscallion. And they used to love that because it made Shakespeare kind of real. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
He would swear and everything like everybody else. It wasn't just writing fancy bloody verse. Poncy verse. So I'm in love with the business and with theatre. Really, I suppose.
Right, a couple of big questions to finish with. First one, you mentioned quite a few theatre companies that you've been involved with. We've got the Library Theatre Company, the Dukes in Lancaster, Northern Stage, Warwick Arts Centre, English Shakespeare Company. We'll skip over Bill Kenwright, shall we?
Bill Kenwright. I learned a lot at Bill Kenwright, let me tell you.
Yeah.
I learned a lot.
And the Everyman and Playhouse, and of course the Octagon. So what do you look back on with the most pride out of all the things that you've done, do you think?
Well, that's interesting. I certainly think that the most successful place I've been is at the Octagon, really. I mean, I think it's the one I'm proudest of. Yeah. I think. I was also very proud of the work I did at Lancaster in creating the TIA team and the permanent company there. And, for instance, like David Calder was in the company. You know, we had some substantial actors. I also started, I was quite very proud, I created the first community theatre company in Birmingham called Second City Theatre Company. Yeah. And we used to go to adventure playgrounds and do work with kids there, and then we used to go around old people's homes and do kind of various things, you know what I mean? And I got David Edgar to write the first play we ever did, which he'd written to rewrite it. We took it around youth clubs. It was called Fired. It was about a kid who'd set fire to a factory. And the play is about, like, he has psychologists and people trying to find out why he did it, and they go into all this for the play. And then at the very last, at the end of the play, he gets some kerosene out, etc., where the kids are, and starts to spray it. And he lights a light, and he says, because he burnt down the factory where he worked, and his last line, this is real Edgar, he said, "Do you want to know why I did it? Because I fucking hate the bastards." There's no explanation other than I'm working for some capitalist sort whom I hate. Yes. I'm certainly very proud of that, and funny enough, not particularly on here. The other thing I take great pride in is that I've been very friendly with Max Stafford Clark for years. I was a founder member of Out of Joint. Their first ever co-production we did was when I was the chief executive at Leicester Haymarket, and we did that wonderful play about the Queen and I, when the Queen is sent to a housing estate, which the housing estate was actually a Leicester housing estate. And I've been on that board ever since. I've been chair of the board for the last sort of 10 years. And I think, you know, that company's extraordinary in the amount of work and new plays they've done, you know. So that's one I also rate very highly. Though I haven't run it, I have to say. I've just been on the board and been chair of the board. But it's a part of my life that exemplifies what I think is important in theatre.
Okay, last question then. What project might you come across that would really excite you, that would really get you fired up again? What sort of thing?
That's very difficult. I'll take anything that's going. I don't know is the answer, because in a way you can't know. I think, like, I fell into the Octagon, never knowing it was going to be this. Do you see what I mean? I mean, I think that's how it works. When you go somewhere, you think, "Oh, this is great, it's going to really work," etc. You're in for a huge bloody disappointment, I'm afraid. It's when you go and you think, "Jesus, what a mess this is." Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Well, all I can do is start to sort it out, and then something happens, and then things take you by surprise. The things that you're most successful at are the things that you never thought you would be, kind of. Do you know what I mean? And the things you think you're going to do very well are usually crap. So I think, you know, I just sort of wait to see what, if anything, turns up, you know, really. And I'm going to continue, obviously, being, hopefully, chair of Out of Joint and the work, you know, and helping to sort of support the work that takes place there. And, I mean, I know they already want to come back here to do another co-production after I've left, for instance. So I can sort of, if Dave and the other, you know, and the new chief executive want to continue with it, well, they've got access to a wonderful new writing company and you know, a quality director and a profile for the region when it ends up as it will do going to London as well. But having started being made in Bolton, really, that's the card on it, is made in Bolton.
That was John Blackmore talking about his life in regional theatre back in October 2011. More recently, I spoke to Mark Babych, artistic director at the Octagon from 1999 to 2009, and now at Hull Truck Theatre, about his memories of his time working with John. What were your first experiences of working with John? He'd already had quite an impressive history before you started working at the Octagon with him. So what were your first memories of him?
I guess he was hugely impressive in the early stages of our working together, because he came in like this sort of fireman who needed to put out a fire, and he was absolutely determined and driven to do it. So I saw a man who was full of ideas of how to solve a problem, and he was going to get on with it, and we felt in very, very safe hands, really. So I suppose what he did immediately was instill confidence that the choppy waters that the theatre we were in at the time could be averted, and that there was a passion for producing, which the theatre was needed to get back to, and he was just absolutely the right man at the right place at the right time.
Yeah. At the time, he'd just come from, he put a plan together to save the Liverpool Everyman and Playhouse by merging them together. But as he said in the interview, he didn't actually have to put that into effect. He just came up with the plan. But when he went to Bolton, he had to actually do that himself. Were things actually as bad as he says when you started at the Octagon?
It's a long time ago now, so memory of it is a little bit hazy. But there was a lot of definite lack of confidence, really, around at the time. I mean, it'd been on such a high for so long, and then this strange thing had happened to it, which had, it's amazing to think that we nearly lost it all that time ago. But yeah, it wasn't, the morale was very, very low, and belief in the organisation appeared to be very low. Finances were running dry. There was this crazy idea that had been tried about being a receiving theatre, and John just took one look at it and just went, "No, this is nonsense. We've got to get back to producing."
Yeah.
So he also there were things happening at the time that I'd only really gone in to do 3 shows, and then then stayed 10 years. But
yeah.
I guess the picture at the beginning was a very turbulent in terms of confidence, in terms of resources, staff morale. There was a lot going on behind the scenes that I think that the pair of us were absolutely determined to rectify, because no one could envisage a world without the Octagon, and it's madness, isn't it, to think of that was a possibility at one point.
Yeah, and it's just now celebrated its 50th birthday, and it's still going strong.
I know, and isn't it great? And then there's the sort of new building emerging from it. It's been on such a high for a long time. The work's great. Elizabeth's doing a great job. David did a great job. It's a fantastic place to work, and it's such passion in that place. And every great town and city deserves a great theatre, and it's certainly got one. And John was very instrumental in that point of crisis where it could have tipped so horribly the other way.
What was your working relationship with him like? Because he's somebody who'd been himself an artistic director. He directed on stage, and he did say in the interview that he did sometimes, you asked him into the rehearsal room. So what did he interfere, or did he have a lot of advice for you?
No, he never interfered at all. Our working relationship was very robust, and we'd exchange a lot of ideas about what plays were good. Sometimes we had very, very widely differing tastes. Sometimes we argued about stuff, but you'd expect that in a healthy artistic relationship, really. It was all driven by passion. The man was enormously passionate about what he did, and so dedicated to theatre, especially making great theatre right on your doorstep. And the theatre didn't belong to just one area of the country. It needed to filter out and be robust anywhere that it was made. And, we'd have, if I was having a problem with wrestling with an idea, he was always someone that I could go to and say, thinking about doing this, what do you think? But he would never come in and say, change this, change that, do this, do that. He always actually put the onus very much on me, and encouraged me to, try and do the very best work that I can. And then occasionally when every artist goes through this period where you don't always make your best work. Yeah. And he would be someone who would gently say, it maybe wasn't the best. But he was never horrible about it. He was very, he was deadly honest. He had a huge honesty about him, really, and sometimes, obviously, you might not want to hear it, but he was always right. He was all right about stuff, and ultimately hugely supportive of the work that we were making. And but I guess my overriding memory of all that was, he was so passionate to the point where, if something wasn't going right, he would get quite argumentative about it. But all driven by love and passion and, wanting to do the very, very best, and nothing but the best would suffice, really.
Yeah. And he was somebody who obviously understood the finances of running a theatre company and how to make it succeed. But he also resisted the idea of becoming overtly commercial. He did seem to push work that was maybe not experimental, but he certainly didn't want to go into just doing the things that made money, did he?
Absolutely. He would always say, why were we even thinking about that play? If the play or the story didn't feel relevant, or it wasn't about it. And the first thing he would ask you was what's it about? What's it about? So it was this real determination to try and get you to think about the story that you're telling and having it sort of sing for now, really. And then occasionally we'd look at a program and we'd go, well, that was really successful, isn't it? But maybe we shouldn't have made that choice because we've lost our nerve here. Let's not make that decision again. So he'd always, whenever you were veering towards a point of safety, because running a theatre is a very precarious task, really. And, once you've got the audience on side, it's a damn sight easier. But, we know from experience that audiences can ebb and flow, and, when you think you've worked it out, something can happen to, divert from that. But he was definitely a man where substance was everything to him. It could be entertaining, it could be, hilarious, it didn't have to be a difficult night in the theatre at all. In fact, far from it. But what he wanted more than anything was for it to be about something, and for it to mean something, and for it to be a genuine experience between the story, the actor, and the audience. And he loved actors. Yeah, absolutely adored them. And and I think that was the director in him. Yeah, coming out of that. And he would tell stories of his days in Newcastle and people he worked with, like Ken Hill, and then talk about his days at the library. So, it was definitely coming from a place of someone who'd really lived a life in the theatre, and someone who, theatre was, apart from his family, was everything to him. It meant so much to him, and I think only his daughters and his wife and family could be on a par with that, really. I mean, it meant a great deal to him.
Yeah, it's funny, in the interview he does actually joke about, he says Joan Littlewood hated actors, and he says, and sometimes you can understand why, and he laughs a lot. He's obviously coming from, he's got a passion for the theatre and for everybody that works in it, really, hasn't he?
Oh yeah, and he's been a great encourager especially of younger talent, and there are people in really good industry positions now who I think really benefited from the experience of working with John, and his tough, robust approach, coupled with a very sort of caring side of him, where he felt he was very passionate about young people and the work that the theatre did with its communities and its young people, and very supportive of the people who ran that side of the Octagon. So it was a very important part of the theatre's DNA.
Yeah, that comes out in the interview, actually. He does talk quite a bit about Active 8, as it was called, and the legacy of the Octagon going back to the 60s, and also the stuff he's done in other places like Birmingham for young people. He seemed really proud of that.
He was genuinely very emotionally engaged with it, not emotionally and intellectually engaged with it. It meant a great deal to him that the theatre wasn't. I think going back to your comment about the actors thing, I think that joke there was, I think what's driving that was that he wanted the theatre to be populated by people, and so that it was, and he would reference Joan Littlewood quite a lot in any conversation that you'd have with him, because I think he was always trying to get you to think about, you're not just doing this for yourself, you were doing it for a reason, and you were doing it for an audience, a constituency, you've got to understand, what the social function of a building is, a theatre company is, and its impact on making a place and making people happy. Who's included in that conversation? Who's included in, being invited to take part in this wonderful thing called theatre?
Yeah.
Don't we've all had the privilege to make careers out of? And, the industry is very hot now on aspects of inclusivity, and it's taken a long time to get there, and there are pioneers of this thinking, and John was, I think, one of these people who at a time where the industry wasn't so great at that sort of thing, he was battering them down the door for that voice to be heard, and it's just so much part of what we do now. We forget that once upon a time it wasn't.
Yeah. It's one of the companies that's had that kind of scandal is Out of Joint, which he was a founder member of, and he was on the board for many years. So I'm sure that that was a terrible blow to him.
I imagine it must be. I mean, I imagine that anybody who's invested so much time and energy and passion and commitment into something, to see that go horribly wrong must feel devastating, and I'm sure that he would be pleased in which the way the direction of the company is going now, and it's not completely disappeared.
Yeah.
And that everybody's waking up to a new code of conduct and practice in the industry, which can only be good for everybody, really.
Yeah. So since you left the Octagon, this where you are now at Hull Truck, this is the first building-based artistic directorship you've had since then. So have you carried anything over from working with John that stayed with you, that helps you in your current position?
There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that I wouldn't have taken on the challenge of this job without the experience of working with John. Because again, I came in at a point of crisis, and having worked with John through a crisis and having helped rebuild an organisation and help to re-establish it and build confidence again, I knew that it could be done. And having done it once, taking on the challenge of a point of crisis in Hull was not strange to me. And I think when I found myself in the most challenging of situations, I'd always say to myself, well, we've done this before, and I'd always remind myself that there was a way through. And John always taught to you that keep your eye on what's coming over the horizon, and no matter what landmines you keep stepping on, there is an end point to this, and there is a goal to this. And if you keep hold of the vision, because it always keep saying, what's the vision, what's the vision? And if you've got a vision that you really believe in and a passion for it, you will get through. Yeah. And you carry people with you. And that tenacity, that never letting go of something that you deeply believe. There are some things in life you just cannot compromise on.
Yeah.
And that's what I've taken to Hull, is an absolute belief that a great city needs a great theatre, and that's the experiences of why theatre matters so much and how it can change and transform lives. I always had that within me, but I guess the experience and working with John all that time really rammed it home. So coming into this new arena, which had a fresh set of challenges, just strengthened the armour that was needed to take it to where it is now.
You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.